Hey guys, Buildzoid here from Actually Hardcore Overclocking, and today we're going to be taking a look at the RTX 2080 Ti Kingpin edition from EVGA. This is the, as far as I'm concerned, the perfect RTX 2080 Ti PCB. It's so perfect, in fact, that I really wish NVIDIA would allow EVGA to make Titans. But that's never going to happen.
Before that, this video is brought to you by Massdrop and the PC37X gaming headset with professional-grade Sennheiser noise-canceling microphone. The PC37X headsets are what we use in the office for phone interviews where audio and mic quality are critical, making for a convenient, high-performance solution for gaming or professional work. The headphones come with a detachable 10-foot cable for safe storage during travel, a standard 3.5mm plug, and soft foam for firm but comfortable fit over the ears. The PC37X headphones stand apart with high mic quality mixed with high-quality audio output. Learn more at the link in the description below.
Let's get right into it, because there's just so much stuff to cover on this thing that that's really interesting that, you know, we need to get through this. So then, starting off with the VRM, in my opinion, the least interesting part of this card, because we've seen so many high-end RTX 2080 Ti. It's always very similar. It's not necessarily the same thing, but it is very similar. You have a Vcore VRM that is split into two parts, normally with 6 power stages on that side, 10 power stages on this side. And the thing is, you know, some of the cards out there, they'll opt for like 8 power stages on this side, and well, the Founders Edition goes to 7, and there's a couple cards that, like, there's one card that goes to 8, and then everybody else goes to 10 on this side, and then 6 on the other. Well, except Gigabyte, where Gigabyte goes to 8 on this side, and then 8 on the other side as well. The top cards end up with 16 power stages in their Vcore VRM. Above the right side, well, yeah, right side Vcore VRM, we find the memory VRM, so VMem up here. That's a 3-phase, which is standard as well. We've got a 1.8 volts rail and a PEX rail in this area. I'm not sure which one's which, because they both do, well, they're both similar regulators. They don't push a whole lot of power, and they both kind of don't matter. So, like, well, no, they matter in the sense that they, like, if these weren't present, the card won't run, but they don't really do anything for overclocking. The PEX rail is, well, PEX rail sometimes helps when you're on liquid nitrogen, but the 1.8 volts rail never does anything. As that's a supporting voltage for the GDDR6. Like, the only reason why you'd ever want to raise the 1.8 volts rail is if for some reason you're running like 1.8 volts memory voltage, but at that point I'd expect the memory controller to die. So again, not really a useful, like, not a realistic use case either. The 1.8 volts might also blow up the memory chips, though memory chips tend to be really, really robust, and it's usually the memory controllers that go first. Anyway, so yeah, it also powers things like the BIOS chips, which run off of 1.8 volts as well. So we have those minor rails. Somewhere in this area on the card, there's going to be a 5 volts regulator, because of course these are smart power stages and they do not run on 12 or 3.3 volts. So there needs to be a 5 volts regulator somewhere on the card to power those. Pretty much, that's pretty much the top level overview of the various voltage regulators on the card. Now then, let's take go into more detail on the Vcore and the memory VRM, because those are the only ones you really need to care about that much, and even those aren't that special. So, we have an MP2888 voltage controller for the Vcore VRM, and we also have another MP2888 for the memory VRM. This is made by Monolithic Power Systems, so, you know, they make power stages, they make controllers, and they actually make some pretty advanced controllers. So this thing is fully digital, goes up to 10 phases, 5 megahertz switching frequency, which is way more than you're ever going to use, because I'm not aware of any power stages or MOSFETs that, well, you could probably find discrete MOSFETs that would do that. They probably wouldn't handle a practical amount of power. That's kind of the issue. If you want a MOSFET that can switch a lot of current, it tends to be kind of slow. So it can go up to 5 megahertz, but EVGA is using it in the 400 to 600 kilohertz range, which basically the switching frequency, it affects your output regulation for the VRM. Essentially, higher switching frequency reduces your output ripple. But the other thing is higher switching frequencies can also negatively impact your VRM efficiency, depending on what kind of power stages you're using and how the rest of the VRM is designed. So yeah, that's why they decide to top out at 600 kilohertz. And not the 1 megahertz that the actual smart power stages support, which are MP86956s from also Monolithic Power Systems. These are 60 amp smart power stages. I'm not sure on I'm not sure that these have any special features. I would assume they do. Like, for example, intersil and say international rectifier, well, they have body braking mode or diode braking mode, which basically is the same thing. It's essentially a way of reducing the voltage overshoot on a load release, which basically means the transition of a VRM going from high current output to low current output. When you do that, you basically end up with a bunch of excess energy stored up in your inductors, and that tends to cause a bunch of voltage overshoot. Now, body braking mode can prevent that by essentially burning off the extra energy on the body diode of the low side MOSFET inside the power stage. Now, I'm not sure that these have this because I can't get a full data sheet for these because it's not public. I was lucky enough to actually get efficiency curves for these, so they support up to a 1 megahertz switching frequency. So yeah, that's basically why EVGA is restricting the VRM up to 600 kilohertz because well, you don't want to go above 1 megahertz because at that point these will stop working properly, and at 1 megahertz they're also going to be very inefficient. So that's kind of the limiting factor on a lot of power stages, is just how far you can push the switching frequency before they become completely start malfunctioning or get really, really hot. I noticed that these were advertised as slightly more accurate than the average smart power stage, which I didn't really bother to verify too much. They also include built-in temperature monitoring, overcurrent protection, over-temperature protection, so basically everything to prevent the VRM from blowing up if something does go horribly wrong. Yeah, that's what makes them smart power stages. This is like a new standard of voltage like power stage from Intel, pretty much. So, you know, we're going to start seeing these a lot. And the thing that's kind of interesting with this VRM from EVGA is that this is the first 2080 Ti that I can think of that actually uses 60 amp smart power stages and not 70 amp smart power stages. Not that that makes a huge difference to the VRM efficiency, as those are our efficiency figures, and quite frankly, this right here is better than all of the other 2080 Ti's that I can remember covering. Partly because these actually, and I'm going to partly blame that on the fact that these come with a data sheet that's actually spec'd at 1.2 volts, not just 1.8. So for a lot of the other power stages, I would take like 1.8 volts efficiency figures and then try scale them down. And with the scaling down, I would be very conservative because as far as I'm concerned, underestimating how much heat something puts out is a lot worse than overestimating it. So essentially with a lot of the other cards, there's a good chance that the efficiency figures for them are too high, which makes these look better than they should be. But nonetheless, these are definitely very, very good and more than you'd ever really need to worry about. It's also worth noting that this H2O, like the H2O 400 amps here, that's a bit generous. Tin from EVGA basically told me that in their testing of the Kingpin edition of this card right here, at 2100 megahertz core clock and 8450 memory clock, the card would pull about 420 watts under 3D Mark. So, you know, I guess if you overvolted the card a lot, and maybe hit 2200 megahertz or something, you might be able to hit that 400 amps. But actually, not necessarily. You could get close to that, but you won't necessarily hit it. Either way, even at 400 amps output, this VRM barely produces any heat. Plus, that heat is spread across like 2 separate sections of VRM. So, yeah, this is going to run really, really cool. And it's going to run even cooler if you've seen the video of this card in the EVGA lab when it was running. This thing has a really elaborate VRM cooling system. Like, this thing's going to have no... Like, I'd be very surprised if this had issues dealing with 600 amps output. Because, you know, you'd have what? You'd have a slightly more than half of that. So let's just say like 45 watts on this side. And there's a massive heatsink on the VRM for this portion of the card. And then there's another really large heatsink on the other end of the card as well. So if you just put airflow over that, it should have absolutely no problem dealing with 68 watts of heat. So 600 amps output. And the VRM here is ridiculous. So, well, Yeah, ridiculous overkill. I mean, even at 700 amps, you know, given enough airflow, this should be no problem to handle for shorter benchmarks. There's a lot of other cards that opt to use the UP9512, which only goes up to 8 phases. The MP2888 goes up to 10 phases. The Galax Hall of Fame card uses an Infineon controller that also goes up to 10 phases. And then the 2080 Ti Strix, as well as the 2080 Ti Matrix, which those two cards share the same PCB, those also use an MP2888 in a 10-phase configuration. This one's standard ridiculous overkill. It uses yet more more of the MP86956s. So, you know, 360 amp power stages for powering your GDDR6, more than enough. Absolutely no concerns there in terms of power delivery either, and the MP2888 for voltage control up there. Now then, things that I think are far more interesting than the VRMs on this card. I guess let's start off with the memory chips. So normally, when you buy a NVIDIA GPU, you get whatever memory chips happen to be on the factory floor that day. And what decides what memory chips are on the factory floor that day is whatever memory chips NVIDIA decided to ship out. Because normally, when board partners buy the GPUs, they'll get the GPU and a set of memory chips with that GPU. Which basically means you're going to end up with whatever NVIDIA decides to ship. As NVIDIA really doesn't care about what kind, like, memory overclocking headroom, you know, EVGA is kind of going out of their way to either, like, hold back on using their supply of GDDR6 that they get from NVIDIA and just, like, filling out the other cards with other memory chips, or they're buying GDDR6 directly from, buying GDDR6 from some kind of vendor that is always going to be Samsung. And the reason why this is important is the Samsung GDDR6 is consistently good, which basically means, like, there are Micron cards out there which do very good memory overclocks, but there's a lot of Micron cards out there where the memory overclocking absolutely sucks. So with the Samsung memory, you're pretty much guaranteed at least, you know, like, good memory overclock. I don't want to be overly generous, but the Samsung GDDR6 should most of the time hit like 1200 or higher offset. Easily higher. I would be very surprised if it didn't do higher, but I don't want to be, you know, I don't want to hype this card up more than I already will with memory overclocking figures that aren't realistic. But there's a lot of things EVGA is doing here that should make the memory absolutely clock like crazy. So one thing is the guaranteed Samsung memory chips, which all generally clock better. The other thing EVGA is doing that I'm a huge fan of is a significantly beefed up output filtering setup for the memory VRM. And one of the things I do to NVIDIA cards these days a lot is just whack a bunch of capacitors onto the memory rails, because I think it was a GTX 1070 where I first noticed that if you just added a bunch of capacitors, the memory overclocking suddenly got way better. Okay, it was a Micron GTX 1070. It sucked. And then I added a bunch of capacitors and it stopped sucking so much. And I had a 2080 Ti Founders Edition to play with, and that's exactly what I did. I whacked a bunch of extra capacitors on the memory rail, and the card basically picked up some plus 75 megahertz offset. You know, this card right here should have that taken care of from the factory, which is great. This has Samsung memory, and this has significantly better output filtering for the memory VRM compared to all the other cards. It also helps that this card will have memory voltage control, which is another easy way to get a bunch of extra memory clock as well, because the GDDR6, the Samsung GDDR6 definitely scales with memory voltage. The memory overclocking on this thing should be absolutely killer. Now that we're on the back of the card, it's also worth noting all of this. So, you know, not only have they significantly improved the output filtering for the memory VRM, they've done the same for the Vcore. Now, on the Vcore side, I actually don't know how much impact this is going to have. I have a sneaking suspicion it's going to have very little, but I've never tried adding this many multi-layer ceramic capacitors to anything, because I'm not a pick and place machine, and this would suck to do. So yeah, on paper, this should help. In practice, I'm not sure how much of a difference this would make, but it is definitely the most, like, like, you can just look at all the other cards. None of them have this many multi-layer ceramic capacitors on the output of their Vcore VRM. And the reason why this is significant that it's multi-layer ceramic capacitors is because multi-layer ceramic capacitors have a far superior frequency response compared to, you know, what you normally find, which is like aluminum polymers or tantalum polymers or any other kind of sort of like electrolytic type capacitor, right? Because they're still electrolytics, they're just solid electrolyte. So yeah, and the thing with the frequency response is basically that means the capacitor is better at filtering out high frequency switching noise from, say, the GPU core. Though admittedly, like, it also is affected by distance, and these are rather far away from the GPU core, which is why I'm like, well, I'm not sure how much impact these would have. Then again, you also have just like transient response, like these would still also help with smoothing over transients. So when the GPU core pulls a lot of current and then suddenly very little current and then suddenly a lot of current again, the multi-layer ceramics will help out with that, you know, since they are fast. The issue, most of the time, the issue with multi-layer ceramics being used for like handling transient response is that they don't have a lot of capacitance to them. But EVGA is kind of solving that by just having so damn many of them. So yeah, it's just like, that's the thing, is like, these are like, if you add this many multi-layer ceramic capacitors, I'd be very surprised if it didn't do anything. But I've been surprised by, like, I've done other things and ended up surprised when it comes to adding capacitors to Vcore VRMs. So yeah, I want to say this makes a difference, but I'm really not sure. It should, but you know, I would like, on liquid nitrogen, I'd expect this to actually help a lot. On ambient, I'm not sure that you'd be stressing the, you know, like the card would be pulling enough current to really make a difference. So the bulk capacitors, now this is an engineering sample card, and you can tell because like this is missing and there's stuff on the back of the card that's also missing. And that basically means that these capacitors you see right here, they're not final. These are not the ones you'll actually see on the retail cards because these are tantalum polymers from Panasonic, and the retail cards are going to be on Panasonic SX series capacitors, and those are SP caps, whereas these are POS caps. And the difference is SP caps are aluminum polymers, and Panasonic makes some very, very low ESR aluminum polymers. And the reason why we want low ESR is essentially it makes the capacitors more efficient, and it makes them just better at doing their job. I mean, Panasonic also makes capacitors that go all the way down to 3 milliohms, but those are ridiculously expensive. And I don't think I've ever seen them used on any GPU ever because of how expensive they are. Like, I guess at this point, everybody's going to be wondering, what's their lifespan rating? Well, it's only 2,000 hours, 105 degrees Celsius. So they're not high endurance. Considering that this VRM is probably going to be running basically at ambient, I'm not worried. Okay, I think it's, and this is actually something worth noting, is a lot of the very low ESR capacitors just straight up don't come in high endurance specs. Like the 3 milliohm ESR capacitors, you can't buy them in 5,000 hours. They just don't make them. They also don't make them in high voltage ratings either. So these are basically capacitors that is just like, they're optimized for raw performance above sort of any kind of consideration for long-term, you know, high temperature endurance, because they're still going to last forever if they're at like 50 degrees Celsius. They're just not going to last forever if the VRM was super, super hot, which it won't be because the VRM is very efficient, right? And really well cooled. So yeah, like I don't see a problem with the capacitor selection that EVGA has gone for. I mean, I kind of wish it went for the 3 milliohm ESR ones, but at the same time, I completely understand that they didn't, because those are, as I said, like ridiculously expensive. And I think with everything that this card is doing, it's just kind of like, okay, you got to stop. Plus, there's like a pile of multi-layer ceramics on the back, you know. Shaving off a couple of milliohms on the bulk capacitors probably wouldn't make much of a difference considering what the back of the card looks like. Let's move on to other cool features. We get triple 8-pin power connectors, which normally I don't think is that cool. The thing with this card is the triple 8-pin power connectors allow this card to ship with a max TDP of 520 watts. So when you max out the power slider in EVGA Precision, for example, this is what the power limit is going to be for the card. And the reasoning for that is 150 watts, 150 watts, 150 watts, and 70 watts. And now, if you remember a lot of my past videos, I say that these power connectors can handle a hell of a lot more power than 150 watts. And that's true. The issue is, NVIDIA won't allow their board partners to ship cards with power limits higher than 150 watts per power connector. Or at least I think that's the situation. Because the way NVIDIA's power limits are actually implemented is there's not really like a full card power limit. It's a per power connector power limit. Which is why this card can have a 520 watt BIOS, power limit, because 150 is in spec, and still in spec. And also the per power connector power limit is the reason why we have all of these MOSFETs and all of those and that, and also this choke and that choke and these guys and those guys. And well, I didn't notice any in this area, so I'm not sure if this is power balanced or not, but basically, because the power limit is per power connector, you end up in this really awkward situation where theoretically it's possible, depending on how you have your VRM connected to the power connectors, it is theoretically possible to end up in a situation where one power connector is pushing 200 watts and another one is pushing 100. And without all of the power balancing stuff, that would cause throttling on the core clock. So that's bad because, effectively it reduces our power target. You have your theoretical 520 watt power limit, but if you're trying to pull 200 watts from one of the connectors and 100 from another one, you're effectively limited to, I'm going to screw this up, 470 watts, right? Instead of the full 520. So you need all of the power balancing to make sure that at any given time, there's 150 watts across, if you're maxing out the total power limit, that it is actually shared properly among all the power connectors. And the way these MOSFETs do that is basically they reassign phases from one connector to the next connector on the fly. So, if we have one phase here that's pushing way more current than the other one, well, there's going to be different currents flowing through each phase. Reassign the phases so that they're all pushing, added up, they're pushing the same amount of power. For each power connector. So that's what all the power balancing is for. Now, if you're on liquid nitrogen, there's going to be an extreme overclocking BIOS that's going to appear on some forum. I'm not sure where. Actually, no. I have a rough idea of where it will show up. And that BIOS will remove such silly things to constrain us as power limits. Because on liquid nitrogen, NVIDIA cards get very, very power hungry. For example, 1080 Ti's will average 800 watts when running on liquid nitrogen, easily. They will average easily 800 watts. Well, Tin from EVGA always actually releases a really cool guide for overclocking these that usually mentions the average LN2 overclocked power draw. And at least for 980 Ti's, it was I think 1100 watts average or something like that. For 1080 Ti's, it was 850 in his guide. So for these, we'll definitely find out what exactly they pull. Either way, with 3 8-pin power connectors, we should be more than sorted because each of these connectors can do at least 360 watts. If you have, a halfway decent power supply. Now then, other features, we have a USB-B micro. That's the wording. And that gives you monitoring capabilities for the card over USB, which is pretty awesome. Then here we have an EV bot header. So if you have an EV bot, you can use it to control voltages on the card, which is, at this point, I wonder how many people there are who are still active in extreme overclocking and also have EV bots. Because those things are pretty rare, because EVGA hasn't been making them for ages. Above that, we have a 4-pin fan header for some reason. Up here, then we have I assume that's for the OLED display that the card comes with. So that'll allow you to monitor things like GPU clocks, FPS, power consumption voltages, like GPU, memory voltage, PEX voltage, 1.8 volts, and 12 volts. It'll also allow you to monitor temperatures across the 12 different sensors on the PCB, as well as the thermal paste monitor, which is a sensor that goes into, I think, minus 60s. So goes pretty far below 0. It doesn't go all the way it doesn't go as low as a K-type. So personally, I would still, if I had one of these cards and I was taking it on liquid nitrogen, I would still glue a K-type thermocouple to the back of the GPU core, because that's actually a really good way to figure out if your thermal paste failed. Because even if you're at like full pot and, you know, temperature the normal temperature sensor that this comes with won't work at that point, and regular 1080 Ti's and 2080 Ti's, they won't register anything at that point. The temperature reading is going to be completely whack. But what I do is I glue a K-type thermocouple to the back of the core, because if you monitor your delta through, like, from the beginning of your session and throughout your session, if your delta suddenly just jumps way up for no apparent reason, you know your thermal paste just failed. And I guess with this, if the card doesn't immediately crash, I would assume with this thermal monitor, the thermal paste monitor on this, it would actually start showing, you know, potentially like minus 50 degrees while your LN2 pot is at minus 200. And if that's happening, you know there's a problem anyway. So it might not be that much of an issue that it doesn't go super low. But personally, I like to be able to monitor the delta, you know, into really negative temperatures. But it is also kind of awkward because you need twice as many thermometers for all of your GPUs and everything. Above the OLED connector right here. Oh, and also the OLED display will allow you to display custom graphics if you feel like making those. Above that, we find the EV bot, not the EV bot header, but a voltage, a probit header. There, that's what EVGA calls it. Essentially, this is a hookup for digital multimeters. Super convenient. It fits snugly onto digital multimeter probes. There's like a connector that goes in there, and that then terminates in connectors for digital multimeter probes that fit snug. So you can hook up your multimeter and you can just set it to voltage, and you can monitor whatever voltages you feel like from your multimeter. So in combination with that OLED display, you'd actually have a very easy time monitoring like 2 voltages at the same time without, you know, needing 2 multimeters. So it's pretty neat. Also, this is a lot better. Like, there's a lot of extreme overclocking cards out there, which basically just give you like voltage read points on the PCB itself. Like, they don't give you any kind of hookup. It's just like solder bumps or something. And it's like, it's nice that they thought about adding that, but at that point I may as well just solder wires to the back of the, like, to the capacitors on the back of the GPU core. At least from my perspective, it's just like, well, if you're not going to give me real hookups, I can just, and I'm going to have to solder to the card anyway. I may as well just solder directly to the back of the core, right? Like, at that point, it doesn't make a difference. This is actually really convenient. So it basically eliminates one of those things that you would have to, you know, so like on a lot of other cards, you'd have to do soldering to get these kinds of hookups. Here, it just comes with it, which is awesome. That's kind of the main reason for the Kingpin cards, is just like, you know, these are cards where you can buy the card, insulate the card, maybe add the extra K-type thermocouple to the back of the core if you're like me, and then throw it on liquid nitrogen. You don't have to do anything else. That's it. You don't have to worry about soldering anything, modding anything, removing resistors, bridging anything, you know, bridging resistors, whatever. Don't have to do anything like that. Buy the card, install the extreme overclocking BIOS, insulate, run. Next, we get a triple BIOS switch. Since you are going to be expected to, like, you know, if you're going to be installing the extreme overclocking BIOS, you will have to flash the BIOS on the card. And if in the BIOS flashing process anything goes wrong, well, having 3 BIOSes makes it that much harder to brick your card, right? Like, instead of having to brick just 2 BIOSes before the card is before the card is unusable, and here you have 3 attempts to not screw up. And then we get some LEDs for indicating which voltage regulators are actually running. So NVDD is our core VRM, so if there's anything wrong with the core, that won't light up. If the memory is if this doesn't turn on, that won't light up. If the PEX rail doesn't turn on, which is one of these, that won't light up. 1.8 volts, you get the idea. 1.8 volts is monitored, and 12 volts is also monitored. So essentially, if there's some kind of issue causing the card to not fire up, and one of these LEDs is turned off, isn't lighting up, well, you know, you can skip a whole lot of troubleshooting with that. Well, you can skip a good chunk of troubleshooting with that. Not a whole lot, because at that point, like, if your Vcore VRM and your memory VRM aren't running, then it's like, why aren't they running? And it might be something like, oh, the 5 volts rail isn't running, which you might have to hunt down at that point. But still, simpler than having a card that has no display output, you know, no display, and you're sitting there like, well, I guess we're going to be taking a multimeter to it and trying to figure out why it's not displaying anything. Well, I think at this point I've covered everything on the front. So let's move back to the back. And this being a, you know, engineering sample, well, we have LEDs for the triple BIOS to indicate which BIOS you're on. But this being an engineering sample, it's missing some features over here. So we have a voltage offset switch, which I'm not sure what exactly it does, but what exactly the offset settings are. But essentially the idea is that you can offset your core voltage by a certain amount. This can be very useful with 28, well, on 1080 Ti's, this would be very useful because 1080 Ti's on high core voltage don't want to start up. Though I assume since this card you'd be setting your voltages in software, that shouldn't be an issue. I guess you would also be able to use this to override any software voltage limitations. You can just go above them by a certain amount, like whatever the offset gives you. So that's potentially useful. I'm not sure I would ever use this myself, but it's here if you feel like you need it. Then we have memory load line settings and GPU load line settings. Now, the settings, if I remember correctly, are basically reduced droop and then droop completely turned off. And you do kind of have to play with them because in some situations, you may find that having a little bit of droop or all of the droop is actually better than having no droop, because droop exists for a reason. And I'm not going to go into explaining why it exists, but essentially on liquid nitrogen, it's actually, it's really obvious if you set up your load line settings wrong on liquid nitrogen, because basically you can you can set a certain voltage, then adjust your load line, and you're going to start crashing in benchmarks instead of finishing them. It's that obvious. At ambient, that doesn't really happen because at ambient, you're not so temperature sensitive, but on liquid nitrogen, it's really, really obvious when your load line is set up wrong. So that pretty much covers everything on the RTX 2080 Ti Kingpin edition. The most, complete art, as I said, I think at the start I said this is basically a perfect RTX 2080 Ti, and I stand by that. It does everything. I can't think of a single thing. Well, no, I can think of one thing I would try. I would really like to see this row of multi-layer ceramics replicated down here, because those are for the memory power, right? And I just have to wonder, could you make the memory clock better if there was more multi-layer ceramics down here for the memory chips that are over there instead of just the chips that are up there, right? It just kind of seems kind of imbalanced. And also, you can't put any over there without shifting the VRM back, and that would potentially have, negative consequences for core clock. So I don't want to mess with that part. But I do wonder, what would happen if there was more of them down here? Could the memory overclocking be even better? But, yeah, other than that, I can't think of anything I would change on this card. It's that good. The only card that I can, out of all the 2080 Ti's that I've seen, the only one that comes even close to this is the Galax Hall of Fame. And the thing with the Hall of Fame cards is they don't have a lot of the things that this has, and they're kind of more awkward to get your hands on the extreme overclocking utilities for. Whereas the Kingpin cards historically have their BIOS, just kind of placed on extreme overclocking forums, and if you need that BIOS and you know where to look, you can get that BIOS. So that's always been kind of my, that's the really awesome part with the Kingpin editions. So yeah, that's it for the video. Thank you for watching. Like, share, subscribe, leave any comments, questions, suggestions down in the comment section below. And if you'd like to support what we do here with Gamers Nexus, there's store.gamersnexus.net if you'd like to pick up some merch like mod mats, shirts, glasses. And if you'd like to support us directly, there's the Gamers Nexus Patreon. There's links to both down in the description below, or in the comment section, or in both, actually. I'm not sure. Steve takes care of that stuff, so. Anyway, I have a YouTube channel called Actually Hardcore Overclocking, where I do a bunch of other overclocking related stuff. It'd be awesome if you checked that out as well. And that's it for the video, so goodbye.